Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we tackle a single relevant question based on our Bible reading for that day. This week our reading is centered around the book of Ephesians. Today I'm joined by Jay Rivenbark and Chris Rexroad, and our reading today was Ephesians chapter 2 verses 1 through 10, but this is Monday, so let me talk a little bit about the theme of Ephesians. So the theme of Ephesians is unity. It focuses on this theme. It emphasizes things like nationality, race, gender, social class are no longer division points in the church, that we have to overlook those things. Instead, we're one body of through faith in Jesus Christ. And he encourages the believers to lay aside those differences and live in love and harmony. And so as we get to chapter 2, that being the theme, chapter 2, verse 8 says, God saved you by his grace when you believed, and you can't take credit for this. It is a gift from God. Salvation is not a reward for the good things we have done, so none of us can boast about it. He says you can't take credit for your salvation. Their way of taking credit would probably look a little different than our way of taking credit. One of the big arguments that you have, I think Galatians probably is the book that spends so much time on circumcision, but in the book of Acts 15, they're arguing specifically about circumcision, so that is something they believed was required, an act that they could do, but it was a keeping of the law. The Jewish culture there was trying to still keep the law, observe the Jewish traditions, and the Gentiles were not necessarily. And we could spend time talking about maybe what they did, but the question that I want to ask today is, what are some subtle ways people try to take credit for their salvation today in modern culture? What are some ways that we might hear? They don't say I'm saved because. I rarely would hear that phrase, but there are some things I think people do and say that make them believe they're saved.
There are a lot of things if we're not careful, and I'm trying to think through those. I probably may have been guilty of some of these at some point in time, such things as particular denominations even, that this is superior to you because of what we believe and how we practice.
Isn't that common among all denominations?
I think it is. I think
to a certain degree.
I think it's kind of like team loyalty to a degree. You know what I'm saying? I would hope that folks that are part of this church wouldn't look at other people groups, including other churches, and say we're better or superior to you. But it's easy to do because we view things from a different perspective, or we put an emphasis on this, and perhaps you don't. And it's easy to get caught up in that. To answer your question, it's very easy. And so beyond that, I think the fact that operating in certain gifts or strengths that the Holy Spirit has given to an individual can make it such that we compare ourselves to others from a point of superiority. Therefore, I must be better. I must have done something right. I must have achieved something because I can do these things. You can't or don't do those things. And the list can just go on and on and on. Simple things like, I have missed church in 43 years. I'm not saying I have. I'm just
church attendance was what I was thinking.
Yeah, church attendance. Even to the point. I think probably you too. Growing up, there was such an emphasis that was literally, when I say a badge of honor, it literally was because they had
some churches
pins.
Had pins.
Because if you had perfect attendance, you could earn those things and.
Then if you had a Wednesday night service into that, you're just at a whole new level.
Oh, well, true.
I still believe that's the case. I still believe people who come to Wednesday night service are on a whole different level.
They're exceptional. So there's just a lot of practical things that I don't think our minds correlate with. Those can be proudful, arrogant, self-promoting things, but they can be.
And let me clarify something here. none of these things are bad. They are actually right things to do. Attending church, learning the Bible,
operating in
your gifts. All of those things are the right thing to do.
Sure.
But when you believe that somehow that is your salvation or you're more saved than other people. Church attendance was one that would have been at the top of my list that I think people try to distinguish. Certain sins that I think people try to distinguish between. You can't be saved, or I question your salvation if you did this or this happened.
Yeah.
Whereas I would never do that. Like we think that's what we think. We distinguish between sins
that aren't ours.
That's right. That aren't ours. Right. We have great compassion on people who have similar sins most of the time.
Most
of the time, we have great compassion on people who have the same sins as ours. We have great angst or anger toward people who have different sins than ours, especially, and the worst kind, the ones that are most troublesome are the ones that we've been hurt by.
Yeah.
So let's just say you are, your spouse committed adultery. Those people tend to be a lot more harsh toward people who do commit adultery, and a lot frown on that, because they've experienced the pain of it. So they tend to lash out, and they have this scale of, and it doesn't make it not wrong. That's not the question.
Yeah.
It becomes, does it make you, are you more saved? Baptism is one that I would see get used. You talked about denominations. Denominations have, over the last 30, maybe longer than this, but certainly I can eyeball it, over the last 30 years have diminished significantly. All denominations have. They may be growing, but most of that growth is amalgamation, where they're bringing in other church groups in other countries. And, frankly, the church is semi-shrinking in the United States, So their influence has gotten less and less, and non-denominational churches have grown. And so now it's not as much denomination as it is a theological bent, where this church might have some Pentecostal theology, where another church might consider themselves Reformed. And, and I'll just be honest with you, I understand Reformed theology, but some of the most arrogant preachers I've ever heard hold that theology because they think they're better than everybody else, Bible translations are another place that we distinguish about, well, you can't be saved if you don't use this. And it's not, the King James is the one that gets the bad rap, but most of the Reformed people I know use the ESV, and they believe, this is the litmus test of theological understanding, and if you don't use the ESV, you're not theologically sound, or and but I mean, I know somebody personally that believes you can't be saved unless you use the King James Bible.
It was actually a conversation we just had in our 1825 life group. A lot of them, there was some of them that talked about growing up that they didn't really understand. One or two people in particular, is like, because we had King James in the house, and that was all that was allowed to be in the house. But for the life of me, I couldn't understand what I was reading. And I was like, well, what good is that to you?
Right. I mean, I preached the entire time I was at my first church, I preached from the King James. And after I came here, the pastor here at the time used the New King James. And so I used it some, and I made a transition to the New Living Translation sometime around 2012, and I haven't changed since then. I just like the rhythm of it. it's easy and understandable. But there are a lot of people who think they're more saved, or that is a piece of their salvation, or what makes them saved.
A thought that keeps reoccurring to me to address this: how do some people take credit or think they've achieved on their own? Is the opposite of what we've been talking about, particular denominations or leaning in a certain way. It is the abandonment of.
Oh yeah.
Because they and I'm thinking of a couple examples that come to my mind where people in essence have said, I'm so superior to everybody else. I'm so deep theologically in my understanding that I don't need or want to be a part of you or any other organized group.
I don't know Jesus.
Yeah. That's right. I'm flying solo because I'm all this. And I think that's a dangerous extreme too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, any time. So, and this isn't to throw shade at a particular group of people, but they're easy, and I could name others in very similar fashion, and I guess I'll do that. But the reason why Methodists are called Methodists is because they developed methods.
Methodologies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, methodologies of how to operate the local church, things the church should do, things that should take place, And so they become Methodists, and it set them apart when they, it became a distinguishing factor for them. The same was true with the Pentecostal churches that the turn of the 20th century, I guess, early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, they have the outpouring of the Holy Spirit in the mountains of North Carolina and on Azusa Street within just a few years of each other, and that becomes their distinguishing factor. And in reality, what I think God tries to do is bring new things at a time when they're needed, for the whole church to adopt, but instead they become this identifying thing that becomes a separatist.
Sure, instead of unifying,
that's right.
They divide because we latch on to those specifics.
And we become, well, we're this and you're not, And, I know a lot of people around the circles that I grew up in believed that you weren't saved unless you spoke in tongues, and that's a real challenge. And I think we allow subtle things, the people we defend, Jay, you talked about anti-church. It's not even I'm so spiritual. It is the church is so bad that I can't associate with it, or the church is, wrong, or I was done wrong, or there's nothing but hypocrites, And I always laugh at people who say that, who go to the gym in January, because the gym's full of hypocrites too.
Pretty much.
If you don't believe it, go back in March. You don't have to wait that long, but go back in March, and you won't have no problem finding a machine to get on. It's because people think they want to do something and they don't. All of us are flawed in some form or fashion. The one thing I am sure of is that, especially things like theology, is I haven't figured it all out.
Yeah.
And 10 years from now, I'll see things differently than I do today, and I go, you know what, that was kind of shallow, wasn't it? Yeah. And so I think anytime Jesus plus anything is a polluted salvation.
Yeah. Yep. I agree.
Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation around the book of Ephesians.